Welcome back, everybody. This is not a Malazan video. Nope, this is Discworld. The great Discworld read-along that I was speaking about a couple of weeks ago. We've started with it, and we started with The Color of Magic. We had our first Zoom chat on everything Color of Magic last week, and it was a lot of fun and I'm once again super happy for everyone who actually joined us on that. So now I want to, give a bit of my thoughts and final thoughts on the color of magic. If you want to join us, the next one will most likely be in 2 or 3 weeks. So you have time to read The Light Fantastic and The Color of Magic, which is, makes a lot of sense because those two are actually linked together. And join us on the Unabridged Burners Discord and talk with us there, and then join us on the Zoom chat, like the Zoom call, and talk more of it. It would be glorious to see you there. But now let's talk Color of Magic, and I hope you don't hear too much of the religious indoctrination happening next door. So let's start this. Cheers. So, Color of Magic is the first Discworld novel. It's rather old. And for a lot of people, it is one of their least favorite ones. It's one that is a bit difficult to actually get in. I've heard a lot of times people say that they started with that book and then they just stopped reading Discworld and never got into it again or something like that. So I want to, talk about what I like about it, and maybe explain a few things that might help make this book a bit more accessible, because I feel it is one of those books where knowing what you're getting into makes it easier to enjoy the things that are in there that are enjoyable, and appreciate the things that are in there, and maybe be a bit more lenient when it comes to its idiosyncrasies and things like that. So what do I mean by that? The first thing is that there is no real plot. I mean, there's no plot that goes from the first chapter to the last chapter, which is can be explained by the fact that it is in fact a collection of several novellas or short stories that were published previously that are then plopped into some kind of narrative. That narrative being that a two-flower, a tourist, comes to Ankh-Morpork, hooks up with Rincewind the wizard, and they have adventures. But that still means that there is no overarching antagonist or anything like that, and these individual adventures seem rather arbitrarily put one after the other. So that's, I guess, the first thing that makes it kind of difficult, or not difficult, but a bit awkward to read if you're expecting a novel, because it's basically a short story collection with a sort of maybe meta plot or something. So in that regard, it is maybe not the best, or I don't want to say not the best, but it's an odd introduction to what people conceive of as a series for a lot of times. And I guess that's the first thing to know. It's you're getting four individual adventures, or stories that showcase different aspects of the Discworld. That's the first thing. The second thing is that these are maybe this has changed in newer editions I'm not aware of, but the one that I have, we see inconsistencies because those were written at different times, and we see a version of the Discworld. I've said that before. Discworld changes over time, and a lot of that is obvious here, because what we see here is that even place names change. Place names that show up in later Discworld novels a lot. One of them is the city of Pseudopolis, that is still called Cephopolis or whatever in the first book, the first story. Another one is the city of Churm, that is obviously the city of Quirm later on, but is once again we see situations where the Discworld, even the geography and the names are not yet fully like settled down into what they will later on become. So this can also be a bit difficult to how to say accept or get used to, that like names change over time. So yeah, that's like the second thing, and I feel this is one of the things that I personally find so interesting, that even within this book, these names change because those stories were written at different times, and we can see over time we can basically see how this work takes shape in the mind of Terry Pratchett and changes and becomes something more or something different. And I personally really appreciate that, but I can understand that it is a bit odd to read that kind of thing. So there's that to get used to, I guess. The next thing that I feel is important to understand here is that while Discworld has always been slightly humorous, its humor has changed. At least part of its humor has changed. And we're going to go into that in a minute. But one huge thing is that it has always been something of a parody. Now, the subjects of its parody have shifted over time from into something more of a parody of our world or different aspects of our world. When you have books that make fun of rock and roll music or pop music in general, but more like rock music, and one that makes fun of the movie industry in Hollywood, and that's or like others that make fun of the postal service or the free press or whatever. All kinds of different aspects of our world that are, you know, are worthy of criticism and parodying, and that's cool. But in these first books, the subject of the parody, the subject of the humor, oftentimes, not always, but quite often, is more the genre of fantasy itself, and its weird little quirks and whatnot, and the genre of fantasy role playing, and its weird, facets and idiosyncrasies in a way. So, at least some of the humor, some of the more specific parody humor, can be a bit difficult to understand if you don't know these facets. There's the other part of the humor of Terry Pratchett that is that still works. There's obviously the absurdist humor in there. There's a lot of it there, like surreal absurdist humor that feels a bit, sometimes almost a bit like Monty Python-esque humor in a way. And then the third aspect is obviously Terry Pratchett's prose. I'm going to go through all three now and look at each with a couple of examples to, explain what I mean with that. Now, the first one, parody humor, obviously works usually in the way that we take a beloved subject, because you can't parody something that you don't love and know well. Everything else is just deriding it. That's why I can't parody hip hop music, because I don't know shit about it. Anyway, what I mean is that Terry Pratchett takes the subject of fantasy, sword and sorcery, and fantasy role playing as it was in the 70s mostly, and looks at the weird parts of it that make total sense for everyone who's deep in the genre and really make no sense from the outside. The first of those obviously is the city of Ankh-Morpork, which is sort of a deeply inspired by the city of Lankhmar in the world of Newon by Fritz Leiber, up to the point that we meet two characters called Brav the Hoblander and the Weasel, who are like straight up parodies or homages, more like, of Fafnir and the Grey Mouser. But we're looking at the city. And the city of Ankma obviously is one of the, if not the, inspiration for almost every fantasy role playing city you ever meet or met up to that point. What I mean there is it has these ideas of guilds. There's a thieves guild, there's an assassins guild, and every Dungeons and Dragons city has a thieves guild and an assassins guild for whatever reason, and no one ever asks about the economy of that kind of thing. More things like that. You play role playing games like in every second, like the amount of street crime, the amount of like thieves gangs, the amount of adventure because obviously you need to adventure, and the amount of taverns and bars in fantasy cities is not really representative or makes any sense compared to like a normal population. So the economies of fantasy cities usually don't make a lot of sense because their place is like their role within a fantasy world or a tabletop gaming world at that point was the place where heroes, after slaughtering monsters somewhere in the wilderness and taking all their gold, can go to spend all that gold on either new armor, but mostly on getting drunk and getting laid. Because, at the time it was mostly played by 15-year-old kids, boys mostly, and 15-year-old boys want stuff they can't get, i.e., get drunk and get laid. And think those are the height of manhood. Uh, sort of. I'm very much, simplifying here, but that's certainly something that you see in a lot of like old like tabletop role playing campaigns and stuff like that. It's exactly those kind of cities. So when Terry Pratchett describes Ankh-Morpork, it does exactly that. The characters have all these like typical weird, random, almost random sounding names that you get in like a lot of these old D&D adventures. Like everyone works for at least one crime boss, maybe two. And in every tavern there happens a tavern brawl every single night because that's the other thing that happens in role-playing games all the time. You send your playable characters into a bar. They usually either find a quest or a brawl or both. That's just like how the conventions of the game work, of those games work, because games obviously have different, you know, techniques, different ways of telling a story, and different requirements. Now, Pratchett goes and takes all of that and just tells it as a story, as if it would make sense. Which, it doesn't. But that's where a lot of the humor comes from. That you have all these facets, all these like things that if you've ever played or looked at like retellings or whatever of old Dungeons and Dragons. Not so much the new one, you still find parts of it there, but that game has changed a lot since like the mid-70s and now. To the better, mostly, I think. But if you looked at that, you'll recognize that. But when you read it as told as a story, you sit back like, that's ridiculous. This doesn't make any sense. Then you obviously add elements of absurdist humor, and you bring in one of these other aspects. That is, you bring in a foreign element, so you can randomly introduce ideas of our modern world into that and see how they clash. The main one, obviously, in this first story, The Color of Magic. That first one being the concept of insurance. More specifically, fire insurance. In a city of very, very greedy people, where the idea of insurance fraud is obviously near and dear to their mind. The other thing that you add there is the idea of vast economic differences, with that tourist showing up and being very, 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 very rich, but not realizing it because he comes from an economic, much more powerful place. So when he offers like his standard rates for a burnt down tavern, which is like enough money to almost buy half the city in Morpork, obviously the choice for the tavern keeper is to burn down the place because that's how people work. So we see that idea, and that's once again one that you find. There's like essays on that in role playing, and the idea of how a party of heroes would like actually fuck up the economy of an entire place when they rob like one tomb or one dungeon came out with like 1,000 gold pieces, and you have like an actual medieval town where basically they bring in twice or thrice the annual like the annual income of the entire city, except the noblemen. How that will work when they all go into town, just spend all that money for goods, because suddenly, inflation, hyperinflation will happen, stuff like that. So we've thought about that in role playing games as well, but Terry Pratchett just adds his own like rather dark look at humanity there as well. So that's another one that is, I feel, one of those aspects, or like ideas that there's so many heroes that for like the questing grounds they were thinking about introducing a rotor, because there's too many heroes for the same dungeon and stuff like that, which once again makes sense for people who've read, or like not read but like played role-playing games, and think about the idea that there's always these parties of adventurers having adventures all the time. It's like, how does that work? As I said, it doesn't, because gaming world gaming space is a different thing than story space, so to speak. So that's what I mean when I talk about parodying the idea of fantasy genre. We see more of that in later stories as well. The Sending of Eight, which is a more Cthulhu-esque story. Among other things, we have this idea of this dark tentacled god, and exactly how like how absurd the idea of like all these like dungeons and temples, occult temples and so forth is. So we see that aspect there. Then in the Lure of the Worm, or whatever it's called, the one with the dragons, we see that not other aspects of that made fun of. One of them certainly being the idea of like chainmail bikinis, or even less of that when you look at illustrations of early, like of 60s, 70s fantasy and role playing games. There is a, I don't even want to call it objectification of women, because it goes beyond that. It's basically, it's almost porn for 15-year-olds. So you have like, women are basically always dressed in almost nothing, and he just takes that to like the next level, and kind of finds explanations for it, which is like, yeah, they get away with it because why not? She's still the most powerful person in that place, so she can wear whatever the fuck she wants. And other things like that. So you see, like, once again, these are ideas where he parodies up to a point mostly the genre of fantasy and like sword and sorcery and fantasy role playing games. So if you have never had any contact with any of that, it can sometimes be a bit difficult to get a lot of the humor, a lot of the in-jokes and stuff like that. Including the point that basically when you look at that idea of the gods in that second game, the second story, The Sending of Eight, the gods basically sitting there and playing what amounts to like a tabletop game with real souls. Just saying. So there's that aspect. The next thing that I feel that I wanted to say is the absurd humor. There is a lot of the absurd humor in there, from the idea of a basically clerk, insurance clerk, an insurance accountant, um, coming to this place, having like demon-driven technology, so like having a camera run by a demon, having a watch, pocket watch run by a demon, having a travel trunk on legs that follows him everywhere. The luggage is obviously one of the most beloved Discworld characters, but those are some of these aspects, or other ideas in there. When we talk, there's like one scene obviously later on where we even break from this, like from the Discworld reality into our reality and back again, which very much reminds me of the Monty Python-esque humor and specific sketches in Monty Python, where things like that could also happen. And suddenly, certain pirates show up in a different part of a movie and stuff like that, because why not? That is a type of humor that I feel. And I guess that's sort of the interesting thing there. That kind of has sometimes a parody element to it, but it's a very different type of humor and a very specific type of humor that is difficult to pull off, and not for everyone. Actually, I feel like most people don't really appreciate or are huge fans of absurdist humor. That's just not because it is so odd and obviously plays with like these stark, weird contrasts in a way. But Pratchett has some of that. It kind of moves further to the background in later books, but here in The Color of Magic, it is still very, very, very present. And I do appreciate that thing with, talking bushes and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's a second type of humor that you find in this book. The third type of humor is the prose. We need to talk about Pratchett's prose a lot. And Terry Pratchett has a very unique prose, and I'm not an expert on these things, so I'm not good at defining what it is. Now, I mean, I can point out some of the aspects. One of them is that obviously Pratchett's prose is always very heavy on wordplay. It's very heavy on wordplay and referencing pop culture. That's just part of it. So there's a lot of double meanings, really dumb jokes in that level when you have the financial wizardry, the financial magic that Two Flower brings to Ankh-Morpork, which is first of all translated as a reflected sound as of underground spirits, also called echognomics. I'm not saying this makes sense, but it makes me laugh. And there's more of that kind of thing going on all the time. But that's only one aspect of Terry Pratchett's prose. Another one is that he certainly does not really bow to conventions of fantasy language, of fantasy prose of the time or modern time. He uses a very like this world modern, almost casual style of prose most of the time, describing the emotions of his characters very much as you might describe the emotions of people in our world, as like the emotions of you and me in a casual way. That's one thing that can come across as odd. The next thing that I feel makes Terry Pratchett's prose unique is his choice of metaphors and comparisons. And the next one would be the ascribing of motivations and intentionality. What do I mean by that? By intentionality and ascribing of motives, I mean that with a lot of like emotions, processes, and so forth, Terry Pratchett describes those as if they were intentional. So it's thoughts behave like people, like bad conscience shows up and kicks over the chairs in Rincewind's brain, which is a weird metaphor as well. But you have these ideas that like forces have personality of themselves. Natural forces do that. Thoughts have that. Emotions have intention. It's not like Rincewind feels bad, but his conscience does something. His conscience acts. And that's something that you'll find in a lot of Terry Pratchett also later on. This idea of like intentionality or personality or whatever you want to call it, of every aspect of existence. which, yeah, it's just something that that happens a lot with Terry Pratchett. What I mean with the odd comparisons and metaphors is that, yeah, he just uses a lot of really like odd but fitting, like really weird, odd comparisons, metaphors to explain things that only work if you have a lot of like knowledge of our world, so real world comparisons, and then you know it's like ideas hit like with all the force of a like a ice hammer. It's like, yeah, okay, that's something I can get, but still, it's not what I expect in what you would expect in a fantasy book, right? So that's another thing that I feel makes Pratchett's prose unique. He can be very poetic, but he usually twists it in a weird way at some point, or puts something in to make it feel slightly off or slightly absurd, which is part of his humor, as I said before. So there's sort of what I feel. If you're okay with any of these, or if you're expecting these kinds of things, then you might have like an easier time reading The Color of Magic and enjoying it. Now let's look at some of the themes you find in there, because there's like ongoing themes that will show up in later Terry Pratchett books as well. Because they are things that like interest him all the time, and you can see already some of those things starting here. One of them is obviously the conflict of like imagination versus banality, or lack of imagination, or organization, or whatever. That's something that we see, like the power of fantasy in a way. It's something that we see very explicitly in the Wyrmberg story, where dragons are basically imagined into existence because there's a lot of magic there. And they're basically imagined into being, and some people can't do it because they just don't believe in dragons and don't have enough faith in the fantastic. That is something that we'll see again and again, the idea of like that loss of imagination, that like duality between imagination and rationality in a way. That's one thing that shows up a lot in Pratchett, and it shows up here. Another thing that we'll see a lot of is the pragmatism, the basic pragmatism of human nature. Now, what do I mean by that? Like, it's something that is important for Pratchett all the time. Pratchett likes to point out, and he does that already here, it certainly happens more in later books as well. Pratchett likes to point out what the driving force in human nature oftentimes is pragmatic self-interest. People don't behave in certain ways because of noble aspirations or anything like that. They're into self-preservation and pragmatism. So they'll always choose the wisest, not the wisest, but the easiest and most pragmatic way to get as much as possible and to survive. Which is not exactly the same as everyone being egotistical. It's always on that border, on the border of that, and we'll see it in later books very much, where that conflict between, is it already egotism to do specific things, or is it still okay in just basic human nature? That, I feel, is another of the themes and topics that you see a lot in these books. Once again, also obviously with aspects like the money thing in the first story and things like that. What else is there? Well, we get introduced to some of the the characters of the series, that being the luggage, that walking box. that being the obviously death, although death also changes over time in a way. So we already see the idea that there is also that idea of personification, anthropomorphic personification of natural forces, that being one of these ideas of the Discworld. We get a bit of like basic layout of the disc being flat, being on the back of elephants that stand on the back of a turtle, having the hub in the middle of it, having the hub in the middle of it, with the Discworld gods being rather simple creatures, to put it mildly. We get that other feeling, that almost a theme. Magic is dangerous. Magic is almost like nuclear power. So we have this idea that like areas that have been hit by a lot of magic produce like all kinds of weirdness and so forth, and it's yeah, that kind of thing. Also, magic already has like this. And this goes back to what I said earlier about the parodying of role-playing game definitions and stuff like that, and themes. Spells are named as ridiculously as a lot of the old Dungeons and Dragons spells that are like, I don't know, Tensor's floating disc or Tasha's hideous laughter. So we have a lot of these like weird name plus does something crazy spell names and levels and stuff like that to make fun of like this idea of how fantasy should work, which is obviously fun and pokes fun at obviously Dungeons and Dragons, and through Dungeons and Dragons at Jack Vance's Dying Earth, where that whole spell system kind of comes from. So, like final thoughts, I personally really appreciate the color of magic, because I like all these things that I've just mentioned. They're just things that vibe with me. I like weird metaphors. I like wordplay and dumb jokes and pop culture references. I've played enough Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games, and I've read enough sword and sorcery stories to appreciate those jokes. And I do sometimes like some Monty Python, so he just gets me everywhere. I do believe that those 4 stories all have different merits. I personally think the last one is maybe the weakest. The Out of the Rim, or whatever it's called, is probably the weakest of the 4 stories in here, the 4 tales in there. The other 3 have all different aspects that I like. If I had to pick a favorite one, I'll probably either go with the second one, The Sending of Eight, or the third one, The Lure of the Worm. But they're all very, very close together. I feel that reading it, if you like Discworld, is obviously essential. It is, I feel, actually, if you really decide to read the entirety of Discworld, I feel it's a good starting point, because you can grow into the world with Terry Pratchett's writing. You can see how the Discworld forms, becomes more well formed, well organized, more firm in its definition throughout the stories. And you get some like really iconic weird scenes and jokes in here, so there's that as well. If you're not sure if Discworld is something for you, and you're not too strong on these things that I've just mentioned, then maybe starting with the later book is a good idea. But in general, I feel the color of magic gets often a bit too much like criticism, because it is a very specific thing, and once again, like, reader expectation is a very, very important aspect of it. So yeah. Have you read Color of Magic? What did you think of it? Did you like it? Did this help you maybe like it more or understand it more? Let me know in the comments. Join us on the Discord. talk about the Light Fantastic, and maybe I'll see some of you in that next Zoom discussion, and we'll just have a friendly chat on the Light Fantastic and all the other things that we can come up with, and thoughts can wander. Yeah, until then, cheers.